Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Charles Lee. I'm currently the Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the US EPA. And we're really excited that to have this session because we've been wanting to have a conversation with you regarding the subject matter here today. And so let me begin by saying on behalf of Paul Mohai and Jay Chakravorty and Sono Jesso, I want to welcome all of you to this session on matrices and the next generation of cumulative impact assessment. This session, as you will find out, is based in large measure on Professor Mohai's work when he served on an Intergovernmental Personnel Agreement at EPA. Some of this subject matter may be a little bit obtuse, but actually, as we hope we can explain, this has really profound practical research, analysis, and policy implications. So, I'm going to start by kind of grounding this presentation, the session, in a few quick slides. Does everybody see that? Is that good?
Not yet, Charles. We don't see it.
You do or don't?
Do not.
Okay, so let me see. I did not then share. Ah, there it goes. Okay, sorry about that. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, so these are a few slides that are meant to kind of ground this session. And it talks about, as the title says, where our EPA's interest on matrix methods came from and why that is important. And of course, you know what, where it came from is the methodology, among others, of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's cumulative impacts regulations. So I'm going to begin with a quick review of the current landscape for cumulative impacts legislation in the U.S., with a focus on the idea there are some with clear and strong mandates to consider equity, how this is significant for achieving compelling and actionable permit decisions, how this got operationalized in New Jersey's landmark law and regulations. The purpose is to show where our interest for this comes from and our desire to start a conversation about its implications. So let me begin by talking about the current landscape for cumulative impact legislation. As of December 2012, and that's probably a little bit outdated, 14 states have either enacted cumulative impact laws or have bills pending. 8 states have permit requirements. That's Minnesota, California, New Jersey, Colorado, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Vermont. So of these, there are several that have equity mandates, but clearly 2 have very strong ones, and that's the ones in New Jersey and New York. So what is an equity mandate? This is kind of an example of this, and maybe even one of the best examples of this is from New Jersey, which is the first state in the nation to require mandatory permit denials if a EJ analysis determines that a new facility will have a disproportionately negative impact on overburdened communities. This comports with their legislative goals about the fact that no community should bear a disproportionate share of adverse consequences, and that it is in the state's public interest that overburdened communities do not take on more environmental impacts. So let me quickly go through the methodology that's involved, and I'm going to start with talking about the regulatory structure. All permit regulations have such a regulatory structure or some kind of regulatory structure. In New Jersey's case, it begins with the determination of what are overburdened communities and non-overburdened communities, with overburdened communities being defined by statute as communities having 40% persons of color, 40% low English proficiency, or for 35% low income. It also defines a set of facilities which will be covered by these regulations, and that is listed here. That is just listed here. Then it defines a set of baseline environmental and public health stressors that are going to be used within the analysis. These include concentrated areas of air pollution, mobile sources, transfer stations, and other solid waste and recycling facilities, water pollution point sources, public health stressors, measures of density and proximity, and social determinants of health. So the next 3 slides are going to talk about the calculation methodology. I am not going to explain all the terms on this. We will share the slides, however, and just for the lack of time. This slide, however, is meant to show the fact that all the information that you would need for this analysis for the New Jersey DEP's regulations is actually found on a one-page report from their EJ mapping tool. That speaks to, one of the things that's really important about that methodology, which is the fact that it's so, in some ways, elegantly simple. The second slide here talks about some important features of this, one of which is, the comparison between communities, or essentially census block groups within an overburdened community and a non-overburdened community. This is an example from a place whose address is 100 Elm Street in Newark, New Jersey. That happens to be the address for the celebrated Ironbound Community Corporation. So for one of these values here, ground level ozone, the value for the census block group at 100 Elm Street is 1.3. This is compared with the lower mean value for either the for non-overburdened communities in either the county or the state, whichever is, like I said, lower. And if you were to look at that, the 1.3 as compared to 1.0, and then this stressor then would be considered adverse. So the last part of this is to look at these in a combined way. And in this case, the combined totals for adverse stressors in the community or the census block group where 100 Elm Street is located is 23 as compared to 13, which then would lead to a finding of disproportionate negative impact, thus requiring actions to avoid those impacts or a denial of the permit. So that's simply stated. There's a lot more to it, but in a very cursory way, just want to give you a sense of what we're talking about in terms of this methodology. So the key takeaways from this would be that one is that having an equity mandate like the one we illustrated enables the state to pursue a disproportionate impact analysis. So it's important to note that the New Jersey DEP regulations is really not a cumulative impact analysis in the traditional way people understand it. It is, in fact, a disproportionate impact analysis done in a cumulative manner. Dr. Mohai's work, which is the subject of the seminar today, it reveals that New Jersey's methodology is really a matrix approach, and he explicated the key features of that methodology. And lastly, and very importantly, New Jersey DEP pursued this approach in the interest of ensuring that their regulations will be both legally and scientifically defensible. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Mohai, who is, as many of you know, one of the most eminent researchers in the field of environmental justice. He, along with the late Professor Bunyan Bryant, organized in 1990 University of Michigan Symposium on Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazard, the first such national academic symposium in the area. Like I said before, Paul worked for the past 2 years with me at US EPA on the Intergovernmental Personnel Agreement, during which time he laid the groundwork for what are indeed matrix methods for cumulative impact assessment, and perhaps the groundwork for, and this is something we want to explore as part of this larger conversation with all of you, a new family or even a new generation of cumulative impact assessment methods that go beyond or are in addition to single scoring methods. So with that, Paul, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Let me just take a second to load up my slides. Can everyone see those slides?
Looks good.
Okay, all right. So yes, thank you, Charles, and hello, everyone. As Charles mentioned, I've been working on developing matrix approaches for cumulative impact assessment and decision making, and I want to begin by just giving an outline of what I intend to speak about. First of all, I want to explain what matrix approaches are. I want to point out the advantages of matrix approaches compared to other methods. I want to show how both the New Jersey's Environmental Justice Mapping and Assessment and Protection Tool and the CEQ's Climate and Economic Justice Screening tools are examples of matrix approaches. And I also want to discuss the potential to expand matrix approaches in decision making by gleaning information from, or gleaning lessons from, two very important outcomes. One is that the concentration of multiple environmental burdens is a function of the intensity of individual burdens and also the number of burdens exceeding minimum intensity thresholds. And the other outcome is that multiple environmental burdens, as you'll see, are very closely related to and are concentrated where vulnerable populations are also concentrated. So let me first begin by explaining what matrix approaches are. To do that, I thought it would be easiest to contrast it with what I think is probably the most prevalent approach for combining various indicators of environmental impact, burden, and social vulnerability. That's CalEnviroScreen. And then I think it's easier to explain how matrix approaches are different. So CalEnviroScreen is, I'm sure many people, maybe everyone in the room, has heard of it or has worked with it. It's one of the oldest environmental justice screening tools that's around. It was made publicly available in 2013 by the California EPA. And what CalEnviroScreen does is it takes a large assortment of environmental burden indicators and social vulnerability indicators, uh, all pretty much measured in various diverse units, standardizes the scores, and then applies an approach. It's really a mathematical formula using addition and multiplication. Basically, that mathematical formula is applied in order to create a single score for every census tract in California. And that score is used to compare and rank census tracts for their relative disadvantage. And if a tract score reaches the 75th percentile or higher, that tract is considered a disadvantaged community, and it qualifies for special funding. Many state level tools, including Michigan's recent tool, My EPA is have been modeled after CalEnviroScreen. Very recently, I think in the last year or so, the CDC's also developed an environmental justice index, which its formula is somewhat different, but it's the same idea, taking a collection of diverse environmental burden indicators and diverse social vulnerability indicators, and then combining them into a single score. I'm not aware of that index being used for decision making right now, but I think it's a good example of one that has been applied nationally. Now, how are matrix approaches different? Well, in matrix approaches don't combine all the diverse environmental burden and social vulnerability values into a single score. These values are kept explicit and distinct. They can be represented as rows and columns in a table or matrix. And then furthermore, environmental burden and social vulnerability values can be evaluated independently, applying separate and unique thresholds or criteria in order to inform a decision. And as Charles mentioned, it's important to emphasize, New Jersey does not use the term they don't use the term matrix approach. Our tool is a matrix approach, and neither does the CEQ. But that's what they are, and I'm going to explain that in this presentation. So in both cases, the tools are being used to make decisions. In New Jersey, it's to decide whether to pose conditions on or deny permits for new sources. And in the case of CEQ, its tool is used to identify communities for special funding under President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. So let me begin by providing a little bit more information about CalEnviroScreen, because I think it, again, helps us better understand how the matrix approaches are different. So this diagram comes right out of the CalEnviroScreen's technical guidance document. And you can see that CalEnviroScreen includes two major categories of indicators, one focused on pollution burdens and the other on population characteristics. And then there's a couple of subcategories under each, and under each you can see the various indicators that are used. So for example, under exposures, under the pollution burden main category, you have ozone concentration, PM 2.5, diesel PM, and a number of others. In the environmental effects subcategory, there's proximity to cleanup sites, groundwater threats, hazardous waste sites, impaired water bodies, and so on. And for population characteristics, again, there's two categories. The sensitive populations has to do with health outcomes like such as asthma and cardiovascular disease and low birth weight. And then there's another subcategory that's focused on socioeconomic indicators such as educational attainment, linguistic isolation, poverty, unemployment, and others. So as you can imagine, these various indicators are measured in different units. California has a formula for combining all these into a single score. If that score reaches the 75th percentile, the community or the census tract is identified as disadvantaged and is prioritized for special funding. Okay, so let me explain how matrix approaches are different. But before I do, I want to point out that the idea for matrix approaches have actually been around for a long time. going back at least as far as 2004, when the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council submitted to the EPA a report entitled Ensuring Risk Reduction in Communities with Multiple Stressors, Environmental Justice and Cumulative Risks and Impacts. You can see in that document a proposed model for a matrix approach. To my knowledge, it was never fully developed and implemented, but at least the idea goes back as far and is documented in that early report. Then in 2013, excuse me, when CalEPA came out with CalEnviroScreen, they also published a couple of months after they came out with their principal tool, the CalEnviroScreen scoring. They came out with a sensitivity analysis of the CalEnviroScreen model, and one of the things that they did consider using a matrix approach, and they compared and contrasted the outcomes with the matrix approach that they developed with the CalEnviroScreen score. Of course, they opted to go with the CalEnviroScreen score, but I think if you go to their documents, and these are still online, you can see an early implementation of the idea of a matrix approach. More recently, in 2022, I worked with a team that included Dr. Sakobi Wilson, Dr. Jay Chakrabarty, Dr. Robin Saha, Dr. Kyle White, and Dr. Ryan Holyfield, where we, in conjunction with Industrial Economics Incorporated, a contractor for the EPA, we were asked to review EJ-Screen and to make recommendations for advancing EJ-Screen. And one of the recommendations we made in that report too was for the EPA to consider matrix approaches in applying the EJ-Screen indicators in order to evaluate census tracts and block groups around the country. And this figure that you see here comes right from that report, and it's an idealized table. We didn't actually go as far as putting numbers to it, but what you can see here is that all of the EJ-Screen indicators like ozone, PM 2.5, et cetera, are represented as rows in the matrix, and then the key social vulnerability indicators such as low income, linguistic isolation, people of color, and education are represented as columns. And we pose that, well, if you display the matrix this way, it's easy to see that you can choose, and apply thresholds to each of those indicators or categories of indicators independently, and then you can count the number of times or number of times the birds meet the criteria. And that could be one way to rank and score disadvantaged communities. So I'm going to go and talk about how New Jersey's model and the CEQ's model are matrix approaches. But before I do, I wanted to point out some important advantages that I see in the matrix approaches, and I wanted to bring that up early, so perhaps you can follow along as I'm explaining this in more detail. First of all, they're mathematically very straightforward and easy to understand, helping to avoid a black box appearance to cumulative impact assessment. They provide an explicit and visible menu of the relevant factors and indicators in identifying disadvantaged communities. They provide flexibility in setting thresholds for environmental burden and social vulnerability categories in designating communities as disadvantaged. They make it easy to analyze and explore the effects on outcomes of adding or excluding indicators and changing indicator intensity threshold levels. And because the menu of indicators, threshold levels set, and number of indicators, meaning the thresholds are visible and flexible, matrix approaches are adaptable to fit a potentially wide range of decision-making contexts, which I hope to show you in this presentation. So let me start with the New Jersey's approach. I'm going to skip this slide. It has to do with the steps involved in applying New Jersey's method, but Charles has already covered a lot of that. So what I want to do instead is go to this matrix. Now, you're not going to find this matrix anywhere in New Jersey's technical documents, and New Jersey does not say they have a matrix approach. They don't use that word, but in effect, that's what they have. And what I've done is I used a specific block group in Atlantic County, New Jersey, as an example. And what you can see is that New Jersey evaluates 26 environmental and public health stressors. And I expressed all those as rows in the matrix. Almost all of them are related to something environmental, such as ground level ozone and particulate matter and drinking water, permitted air sites and proximity to railroads and various levels of traffic. So 24 of those indicators are all environmental, but 2 of them are socioeconomic. One is the unemployment rate, which I put in a different color just to make it stand out, and also education levels, which is measured in terms of the percent who have less than high school education. Now, the stressors are expressed as rows. The 3 principal socioeconomic indicators, or I should say the social vulnerability indicators, are the low income percentage for the block group, the percentage of people of color in the block group, and the percent of the population in the block group are linguistically isolated. And in New Jersey's approach, if a block group, if the concentration of those 3 groups meet the thresholds that are indicated, that block group is designated as an overburdened community block group. So in other words, if the low income percentage of the block group is at least 35% or higher, or if the people of color percentage is greater than or equal to 40%, or the percent who are linguistically isolated is greater than or equal to 40%, New Jersey classifies that as an overburdened community block group. It's really important too to point out that it's not necessary for all 3 of those criteria to be met. If any one of those criteria are met, that block group is considered to be an overburdened community block group. And for this particular block group in Atlantic County, what I've indicated here is that it meets 2 of the 3 criteria, the low income percentage and the people of color percentage. Now, identifying which block groups are the overburdened community block groups is important in New Jersey's method, not only substantively, but also for the method itself, because once those block groups have been identified, those are separated from the non-overburdened community block groups. And it's actually the median stressor values for the non-overburdened community block groups that provide the critical thresholds that are applied to the 26 environmental stressors. New Jersey finds the median stressor values for the non-overburdened community block groups for both the state and for every one of its 21 counties. And if it's trying to make a decision for an overburdened community block group as to whether or not a permit should be conditioned or denied, it's going to actually look at the smaller of those stressor values, the smaller of those median stressor values, state or county, and if the stressor value for the overburdened community block group of interest exceeds the median of the median value for the state or the county, whichever is lower, then that stressor is considered an adverse stressor. And then New Jersey counts the number of adverse stressors in the block group. And as you can see in this example, there are 14. And then what New Jersey does, it compares that number to the median count for the non-overburdened community block groups in the state, which is 13, and for Atlantic County in this case, which is 10. And then uses the smaller of the 2 as the critical threshold here. So, and they call the smaller of the 2 the geographic point of comparison. So the geographic point of comparison is 10, 14 is bigger than 10. So in this case, the permit would either be conditioned or denied. Okay, so that's how New Jersey's method would look like and work. Framed as a matrix. One of the things that I did, because this gets at the question of assessing the concentration of multiple environmental burdens, is that I counted the number or I counted the combined stressor totals. That's what the CET stands for, and look to see how that was related to the concentration of the three key groups that New Jersey considers, which is low income population, the concentration of people of color, and the concentration of those that are linguistically isolated. I started, things are pretty flat before you get to the maximum geographic point of comparison, which is 13. But if you continue to count, whoops, I'm sorry. When you continue to count the number of adverse stressors in the block groups in New Jersey, in this case, I looked specifically at the 3,475 overburdened community block groups. You can see that the concentration of the vulnerable populations keeps going up. In every case, there's some flattening for people of color at about a count of 18, but they keep going up generally, and here's linguistically isolated. So there's two things that I got from discovering this. One is that if in some other decision context where you wanted to identify the especially burdened communities, you can do that, and you would find that the concentration of vulnerable populations also goes up as the concentration of burden goes up, as measured in this way, where I'm counting the number of adverse stressors in the block groups in New Jersey. Okay, let me talk about the CEQ's climate and economic justice screening tool as an example of a matrix approach. Again, CEQ doesn't use that word or considers its approach as a matrix approach, but in effect, that's what it is. CEQ has 30 environmental, climate, or other burdens, and they, as before, they all can be expressed as a row in the matrix. In this case, there's a mix of things. There's things that are strictly environmental, such as proximity to hazardous waste facilities and PM 2.5 in the air. But there's also some health burdens, such as asthma, diabetes, and heart disease, and low life expectancy. And there's also 4 socioeconomic indicators, as you can see here, that are also considered a burden. So there's somewhat of a mix of things. It's not just strictly environmental. Its chief socioeconomic indicator, however, is the low income percentage in the census tract, in this case, all census tracts in the US. And the critical threshold for that has to be the 65th percentile or higher. So if you have a tract and at least one of these burden thresholds are met, and most of them are at the 90th percentile, and it meets the socioeconomic or low income percentage threshold of 60, being at the 65th percentile or higher, then that community would be considered disadvantaged and would qualify for funding under the Justice 40 initiative. What's different about the CEQ's approach is that only one of these burdens needs to reach those thresholds. And the CEQ does not count them as New Jersey does. But so I decided, what would happen if you did count them? And just to make the example simple, I just looked at the proximity indicators, proximity to environmental sites, such as lack of green space, proximity to hazardous waste facilities, and proximity to Superfund sites, and so on. And there's 9 of these. I looked to see whether they met their respective thresholds. Did it meet the low income percentage thresholds? And when I counted these specific proximity burdens, I did what I did with New Jersey. I looked to see how the concentration of vulnerable populations increased as the count got bigger. The maximum count here was actually 7 out of 9. So these bars reflect the counts of 0 all the way up to 7. I put a vertical line to show only one of these has to be met. The criteria for only one has to be met to be considered a disadvantaged community. But if we wanted to identify even more heavily impacted communities, we would see that the concentration of vulnerable populations would keep going up in most cases. Here are the percent of the tracks that were historically underinvested in. Here's the percentage of people of color, percent linguistically isolated, and so on. Okay, so this analysis that I did with both CEQ's data and with the New Jersey's data already pointed me in the direction that if you count the number of burdens that meet the specified thresholds, intuitively we can see we're talking about communities that are more heavily burdened, and at the same time we find that more heavily burdened communities are also where socially vulnerable populations are also concentrated. I'm going to show you the results of investigating that further using EJ-Screen data, but I also wanted to raise the second issue. We were talking about counts of burdens meeting a specified threshold, but what would happen if we varied the thresholds themselves? So this is just kind of a summary of the current thresholds being used. I already mentioned them. California uses the 75th percentile for CalEnviroScreen. CEQ uses the 90th percentile for burdens and the 65th percentile for its low income percentage. And then New Jersey uses the 50th percentile of the stressor values for the non-overburdened community block groups and the median counts of adverse stressors as the critical thresholds in its tool. So a natural question to ask is what would happen if the thresholds were raised or lowered, and then would that help us to make decisions about the appropriate threshold for other decision contexts? So let me show you what I found. And again, what I did was I used the 13 EJ-Screen environmental burden indicators. Here's the complete list. Most of the indicators have to do with concentrations of various types of air pollutants like particulate matter and ozone and diesel and so on. The other main type of indicators, proximity to hazardous sites such as Superfund sites and risk management plant facility sites and others. So the first thing I wanted to address, since that question really hasn't been looked at closely as far as I know, is how does the concentration of vulnerable populations change as the intensity levels of the environmental burden values change? So I looked at the distributions of all 13 EJ-Screen indicators, and as my principal example, I'm going to look at diesel PM. And again, this represents the results for about 80,000 census tracts, but because it includes all 50 states and Puerto Rico. And essentially, I sorted the tracts based on the diesel PM concentration, so from lowest to highest. And one of the things that you see is that the distribution curve is exponential, and I think that's an important thing to know. Exponential means that as you're going from the lowest values to the highest values, the values increase at an accelerating rate. So you can see before you reach the 50th percentile, the slope of that curve is less than once you get on the other side of the 50th percentile, and at about the 90th percentile, it goes up very quickly, forming a hockey stick. I found that these two, the 50th percentile and 90th percentile, are particularly important to look at because anything above the 50th percentile is disproportionate, and also you don't get the same degree of change before you get to the 50th percentile. And also in 12 out of 13 cases, I found a similar inflection point at around the 90th percentile, where you get a hockey stick on the other end. So what I wanted to know was, well, how does the concentration of vulnerable populations change as I move up that curve? And what I did was I sorted, or I grouped the tracks based on their values going up that curve. But here are the categories I looked at. This light blue bar represents the concentration of people of color for tracks where the diesel PM values range from 0 to the 50th percentile. The orange bar represents the 50th, the 60th, the gray represents the 60th, the 70th, the yellow represents the 70th, the 80th, the dark blue represents the 80th to 90th, and then the green bar represents over 90. And you can see as you're moving up that curve, and this is particularly pronounced for people of color, you can see how dramatically those increases occur. It's just almost a straight line up to where you get above the 60%. And a similar pattern is found for the other social vulnerability indicators, but they're not quite as dramatic. For low income here, there's actually a little bit of a dip going from the less than 50th percentile to the 50th, the 60th decile, but it continues to increase after that. And you see a similar pattern for the other social vulnerability indicators. So just quickly, and I'm not looking at all 13 burden indicators, but these are 4 of the air pollution concentration indicators in EPA diesel PM, which is what we just looked at, particulate matter 2.5, ozone, and toxic releases to the air. And you can see that the shapes of the curve are somewhat different, but they're all exponential after the FU cross the median. And you can see that about the 90th percentile or somewhere after, you get the hockey stick effect. Here's another 4 EJ screen indicators. These are the proximity indicators, proximity to hazardous sites. The first one is proximity to resource management plan facilities. The next one is proximity to hazardous waste facilities, underground storage tanks, and proximity to Superfund sites. You can see the same kind of curves as we saw in the previous slides. Again, they're exponential, and you get a hockey stick at or just after the 90th percentile. And what I did for all those curves was the same thing. How does the concentration of people of color and other socially vulnerable groups change as you go up the curves? And you can see the patterns are similar to what you saw before. I tended to find that the people of color percentage changes always were the steepest. As you can see here, this is for the air pollution concentration indicators. These are for the proximity indicators. Okay, so anyway, those patterns show that the intensity, the magnitude of the individual burdens matter, not just intuitively. You know that things are going to be worse off if the magnitude of the burden is greater, but that analysis demonstrates that the concentration of vulnerable populations also increase when those intensity levels increase. So the next thing I did was to look more systematically at how the concentration of vulnerable populations change as the number of burdens exceeding a specified intensity threshold changes. So this is elaborating on that the count analysis I did for the New Jersey data and for the CEQ data. So here's the first slide I want to show you. This is looking at the number of the environmental burdens out of the 13 EJ screen environmental burdens that exceed the 50th percentile. And so the range goes from 0 to 13. And as you can see, again, for people of color, how dramatic that change goes from 0 to 13. This is almost a linear change. We almost reached the 70th percentile, or I'm sorry, not a percentile, but a percent of people of color at the count of 13. And I also found the median counts for all the 80-some thousand census tracts for the US. And you can see that even though, for example, the low income percentage isn't quite as dramatic as for the people of color percentage, it's rather flat for the first few counts. Whoops, sorry. Once you reach the median and go beyond it, the concentration of the low income populations increase. And that's the same pattern for the other indicators. Here's education, here's limited English, and here's the unemployment rate. If I increase the threshold levels, the bars get steeper. The median count is 4 in this case, but you see a similar pattern in the changes Here's the 80th percentile. Again, the bars get bigger, they get steeper. The median count here is 3. And here's the 80th percentile. And here's the 90th percentile. And here the median count is only 1. The count doesn't exceed 9 because there aren't tracks with more than 9 birds that exceed the 90th percentile. So finally, what I want to show you is putting that both together. So 2 things I want to emphasize again is that the concentration of environmental burdens can be seen as as a function of both the magnitude or intensity of the individual burdens, but it's also a function of the number of burdens that meet or exceed the specified thresholds. And as you've already seen, when those go up, the concentration of vulnerable populations also goes up. And I'm going to demonstrate this in a slightly different way. This is just looking at the people of color percentages. And in this case, I have multiple lines. Each line represents a threshold level. So the light blue line, the lowest line, represents the 50th percentile, and the orange, the 60th, the gray is the 70th, the yellow, the 80th, and the dark blue, the 90th. And you can see how the concentration of people of color goes up as both the intensity levels go up, but also the counts, the number of burdens that reach the intensity thresholds. They both result in ever increasing concentrations of people of color. And here is the outcome for percent with limited English. The shape of the curves are different, but the patterns are identical to what you saw before. Here's the pattern for those with less than a high school education. Here's the outcome for percent with low income. In this case, the results are a little bit more ambiguous. You see some crossing in the line. So after the count of about 5 or 6, so there's a little bit of more ambiguity for that one. And here's the results for the percent who are unemployed. Okay, so let me then summarize what I've presented today. First of all, New Jersey's EJ map and CEQ CGEST are examples of matrix approaches to decision making, although they're currently not labeled as such. 2, although current decision making tools use thresholds at the 50th, 75th, and 90th percentiles, matrix approaches are flexible and can use any threshold levels along the indicators distributions. Number 3, the concentration of multiple environmental burdens is a function of both the magnitude or intensity of individual environmental burdens and the number or count of burdens that meet or exceed specified intensity thresholds. 4, as environmental burden intensity threshold levels increase and the number of burdens exceeding those thresholds increase, the concentration of vulnerable populations also steadily increase. So these findings, along with the advantages identified, indicate that matrix approaches can be applied to fit a potentially wide range of decision-making contexts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was a great presentation, and we're going to follow up with 2 sets of reflections. There you go. Thank you, Paul. We're going to follow up with 2 sets of reflections. One from Professor Jay Chakravorty, who's the Mellencamp Chair in Racial Environmental Justice at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. He is a member of the EPA Science Advisory Board, as well as a member of the National Academy's panel on EJ screening methods and Justice 40. He provided a chat. He's well published, including a chapter in the Rutledge Handbook on Environmental Justice, which many of you know is a massive volume in the EJ, as well as the U.S. government's 5th National Climate Assessment. So, Jay, why don't we hand it over to you?
Thank you, Charles, for the introduction and inviting me to speak on this session and reflect on Dr. Paul Mohai's new project on cumulative impacts analysis for environmental justice assessment. And of course, thanks to everyone attending or tuning into our session. And before I get into the impacts or implications of Dr. Paul Mohai's new matrix methodology, which he just presented for future environmental justice or EJ research, I should point out, and most of you here probably know this already, that Dr. Mohai and our session organizer, Charles Lee, have authored many important EJ studies and widely cited publications that broke new ground for EJ research conceptually and methodologically, and also provided useful scientific evidence to support the EJ movement and inform several national EJ policies. So over the last few decades, their work and Dr. Mohai's scholarship has not only led to new methods and tools for EJ analysis, but also inspired many students and scholars of environmental justice, like myself. I feel almost a whole generation of quantitative EJ researchers, including me, have been influenced in many ways by Dr. Mohai's, groundbreaking studies in the past, and we have all been, in a way, trying to follow the trail he has blazed over the years. So I'm really honored to reflect on Dr. Mohai's latest project on cumulative impact assessment for EJ analysis. Now, this matrix-based approach he has developed that you just saw the presentation as well. It's capable of transforming EJ research and move it forward in several new and different directions. I feel that it can serve as a very useful framework or foundation that can lead to a whole new generation of EJ-related questions and answers, as well as approaches and tools for cumulative impacts assessment. So I'll try to, in the time remaining, briefly highlight its key contributions to EJ research and scholarship under three headings. I'm going to break it down in terms of the conceptual contributions, methodological contributions, and finally the empirical contributions. Now, if you think of starting with the conceptual component, a lot of quantitative EJ research and studies have focused on demonstrating that injustice exists in using various spatial or statistical approaches. Now, proving the existence or presence of a disproportionate impact was very useful and important in the past, but in recent years, EJ scholars and decision makers have emphasized the need to move beyond existence to understanding the nature and extent of inequality in the impacts of various environmental outcomes. So I think this is where the matrix approach becomes really useful by explicitly considering both the concentration and distribution of environmental risk burdens simultaneously. So I think that's a really important conceptual contribution of the work. And in terms of the methodological implications for future research, as Dr. Mohai mentioned, this matrix approach allows us to consider both the magnitude or intensity of individual risk burdens, as well as the number of count of burdens that meet specific intensity thresholds, at the same time. So we can explore or visualize how the percentage of people in any particular social category or vulnerable group, such as low income or people of color, can change with respect to both the intensity of number and number of burdens based on user-defined thresholds or percentiles. I think this flexibility or allowing users to choose their own threshold intensity level implies that this matrix approach can be adjusted to fit a wide range of decision-making contexts as well as research questions that are relevant to EJ. And by combining the concentration and distribution of risk burdens imposed on any chosen vulnerable group, we get, or this approach provides almost a three-dimensional approach to measuring unequal impacts that no one has done before, at least in the context of EJ. So in this three-dimensional representation, we could even plot the intensity of individual burdens on one axis, the number or count of burdens meeting a specific threshold level on the second axis, and how the percentage of a socially vulnerable group, such as low income or people of color, increases or decreases with respect to both intensity and count of burdens on the third axis. So this provides a really unique and comprehensive picture, I think, and that should lead to new insights that will support both EJ research as well as future policy decisions. Now, in terms of the empirical contribution to future EJ research, Dr. Mohai's approach provides a very important foundation for several new and somewhat understudied questions. And as you just saw in the presentation, an important feature of this work is not just to show how the approach works, visually and statistically, but also to indicate that there is a clear empirical pattern of environmental inequality within the US, or at least at the national scale that he just showed us. Specifically, concentrations of vulnerable people increase as intensity threshold levels and the number of burdens increase, right? Which means that, a similar framework or this framework can be easily extended to examine other socially vulnerable groups beyond the 5 variables that Dr. Mohai just analyzed or presented in terms of their concentration and distribution with respect to risk burdens or even access to benefits. So I'm talking about groups such as people with disabilities, immigrants, incarcerated populations, public housing residents, and many other disadvantaged groups, some of whom are actually being discussed, I guess, in other sessions of the symposium. And at the same time, in recent years, several EJ scholars have also focused on intersectional inequalities or unequal impacts experienced by people at the convergence of multiple marginalized identities. For example, those who are low income and disabled, those who are African American and unemployed, and many other combinations of commonly used categories related to race, class, and other measures of social disadvantage. So that can also be easily analyzed using this approach as a starting point. And in terms of the future empirical implications, I think there are also exciting possibilities for extending this analysis to look at some of the spatial implications of these findings, which he just presented. So to move this work forward, I feel we also need to ask the where question, or where are the communities or neighborhoods or census tracts where higher intensity of burdens, higher number of burdens, and higher proportions of vulnerable populations coincide at the same time spatially within the US as a whole or in a specific region or a state. And this is what's really exciting to me as a geospatial researcher, linking some of the cumulative impacts assessment results from Dr. Mohai's matrix approach to new spatial analytic tools that can identify locations of these statistical hotspots, where overburdened and vulnerable people are likely to live. So some of these results, I think, can be used as input data for local indicators of spatial association that allow us to identify these places or census tracts or block groups at the intersection of higher concentrations of risk burdens and higher social vulnerability. That would be a logical next step in terms of moving this forward. So in conclusion, I just wanted to reiterate that Dr. Mohai has developed a really exciting cutting edge approach for extending EJ analysis that is conceptually innovative, scientifically rigorous, and empirically very useful. And like he has done many times since the 1990s, Dr. Mohai's new approach should provide an important springboard or starting point for the next generation of quantitative EJ methods and tools, as well as new research questions on how cumulative impacts are measured and experienced locally. And that should also lead to more precise policy interventions and solutions that address EJ, which is the focus of the next, reflection. So that concludes my reflections on the research component of Dr. Mohai's work. Thank you all for listening. And our next speaker, Sona Jessel, will talk about the policy implications. Thanks.
Great. Well, let me just say a few words about Sono. She is currently the senior program director for Building Power Resource Center. She is an advisor and was the former director of policy at WEAC for Environmental Justice, where she led a policy team responsible for advancing the policy agenda of WEAC at local, state, and national levels. She led a coalition to advance the New York State's cumulative impacts law. And like I said before, the one of the reasons why we wanted to have this session is to open a conversation with all of you about the practical implications of this methodology as far as application within situations similar to New Jersey. So, Sonal?
Thank you so much, and thanks to the previous panelists for all of the amazing information that we've heard so far. I'm happy to just take a few minutes before we hopefully get some great questions from the audience on the policy implications and where this kind of leads advocates and different sort of activists in the space trying to move cumulative impacts forward within the environmental justice movement. Like Dr. Lee said, I helped lead the work on passing the cumulative impacts law in New York State as in my position at We Act for Environmental Justice, and I'm continuing to sort of advise on the rollout of this very important law. And it's very similar to New Jersey's law. The New York law was able to be passed because New Jersey did it before, and we were able to really catapult the New York work because something had already been done in one state. And really in the environmental justice movement nationally, we hope that we continue to have this snowball effect of passing good cumulative impacts legislation in each state to protect environmental justice communities. And I'll just point out some of the key differences that are important to have in mind when looking at these laws. The New Jersey law specifically includes language around public participation, which is a really key pillar for advancing environmental justice work and adhering to the Hamas principles of environmental justice, having community at the table, self-determining decision-making around facilities in their community is vital. And so New Jersey, including that language specifically in the law, is really important. And that's something that New York does not have explicitly in the cumulative impacts law, but does have policies on it outside of that specific law. The other piece, which I'll bring up a little bit in my reflection, is that the New York law becomes a little bit stronger than New Jersey, and that it includes some really interesting language around mitigation of existing polluting facilities and what is the responsibility by the state to reduce these existing disproportionate burdens that already exist in environmental justice communities. Arguably, some of these are the facilities that make these communities burdened in the first place. And so those are two key components. The other key component is that's very interesting for this conversation is that New York State started the implementation of the cumulative impacts law with a disadvantaged communities map already created that is essentially some kind of a calculation of cumulative burden. And so New York State was starting with a very specific baseline that already had a about 3-year process of creating this definition of who is disadvantaged in New York State. And so this law has to be kind of building off of that definition, which makes it a very specific scenario. But just to kind of reflect a little bit on what this matrix methodology could mean for advocacy for some of the policy folks on this call today is a couple things. I mean, one key, most important thing here is that there is now an existing methodology with strong scientific foundation that can be used to move cumulative impacts laws forward. When New Jersey was setting out to do this work, and then New York, and then other states like California and some other states that sort of have some cumulative impacts considerations, we're doing this is all not to everyone, but to legislators maybe, was uncharted territory, where deciding how to determine who is overburdened, what is a cumulative impact, how do you make these calculations, How do you decide that facilities are responsible towards each other? All of these questions that are really big, difficult, meaty questions can really be helped answer through this matrix approach. And what's important is that there's a clear methodology that any state, when implementing cumulative impacts legislation, they can really fall back on that when given pushback by any kind of stakeholders that may not want to see cumulative impacts work move forward. There's a very clear methodology to fall back on to really show, okay, here's how we got to the place of saying no to this permit. Here's the methodology. Here's this matrix approach. That is really key. Having that already when you go into a campaign to create any kind of policy on cumulative impacts will put you already 10 steps ahead of where we were in New York and where I'm sure the advocates were in New Jersey as well when starting this process. The other really important piece is that having a clear methodology for determining cumulative impacts also really helps give legal strength to the laws. We know that there already is and that there will be future litigation by facilities who are opening a lot of questions around who is responsible for what pollution and how do you really make clear determinations on that. And again, having clear methodology for how these decisions were made continues to provide a lot more strength towards the work to hopefully not only help environmental justice advocates and leaders create cumulative impacts laws in their states, but also keep them intact when implementation happens and not end up in the battles that a lot of people are kind of concerned will happen with changes to how permitting decisions are made. The last two things I'll bring up before we kind of go to some questions and comments is something that I'm wondering and thinking about in this consideration of this approach is around the existing facilities piece. How can this matrix approach be used to help state agencies decide what kinds of restrictions, or if any, they would put on existing facilities? That's a question that's being asked in New York right now. And certainly, I hope will come up in other states as they also think about how to address the historical pollution that's already happening in environmental justice communities. So that's something that I'm thinking about a lot. And I think also thinking about how do we decide how many socioeconomic characteristics need to go into a calculation is an interesting question. And how do we come to some of those decisions in a way where we are, again, standing on strong footing when there is opposition? Because from the policy side, that's definitely something that we get a lot, is how do you determine where, socioeconomic indicators, for example, are more important or equally as important as the environmental indicators that we're talking about. That's something that comes up a lot in the policy conversation. But I'll say overall, it's really exciting to have an approach that is clear, that has a good method, and really excited to hear what others think. But in the advocacy space, I would say it is definitely really helpful, and hopefully this really helps other states and other advocates in the states be able to move forward with cumulative impacts laws themselves. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sono. So let's open it up for question. The first one is, of course, on the chat is, are there going to be time for questions? So I guess there is, right? That's an affirmative. Second is, can we get a link to Professor Mohai's study? The answer is yes. We are going to, EPA is going to be posting this. In the meantime, reach out to either myself or Paul, and I'm sure we can get you a copy. Let's see, any other messages? One other new message. Oh, there's 10 minutes left. More questions? I don't see any more questions. Okay, so let me if in the meantime let me ask Paul a question. Where do you hope that this research will lead to?
Well, I think that Hopefully, well, a number of things. One is that I hope that there's more attention that'll be given to the question of how multiple environmental burdens, in fact, are concentrated. You know, all the research, all the prior research until recently, because data just weren't there, have looked at one thing at a time, one environmental burden at a time, and we've looked to see are they distributed, how are they distributed socioeconomically and by race and a lot of different factors. I mean, part of that is understandable because we didn't have the data. But what's very interesting is that with the advent of tools like CalEnviroScreen, which was the first publicly available tool that measured multiple environmental burdens and combined it with socioeconomic data, we have just in that tool alone multiple environmental burdens that can be analyzed simultaneously. And of course, now we also had EPA become public in 2015, and the CDC's tool just within the last year or two has come online. So they, in fact, provide opportunity to study the cumulative impacts. And certainly when New Jersey came out with its method, New Jersey had cumulative indicators for environmental stressors and not only collected that data, but also turned that into a decision-making tool. So, so I can see a lot of future research. I would say that we need to continue to develop good environmental burden indicators. So EPA right now has 13. I believe CDC's has maybe 17. But we need to continue to work on developing those data and formatting those data so that they can be included in data sets like EPA and the CEQ's model and the CDC's. And because I think once we have, with more data, we can actually better match the data with community circumstances. Right now, one of the limitations of any of these tools is we only can measure what we have data for. But what about the environmental problems that we know that are out there that we don't yet have data, systematic data, especially at the national level, such as the impact of hog farming is a good example, I think. So I'm really hopeful that we'll have more data, but I think with time too, I think with all these efforts, the agencies involved, such as EPA and CalEPA and others, are looking to see how to improve that data, how to improve the data and how to increase the number of really useful indicators. So, and I just want, first of all, I want to thank everyone and Jay and so on, Lynn Charles, for their comments and their constructive statements about this work. What I want to say is too is that I was going to mention something that Sonal said about how helpful it was to New York's effort that New Jersey already came out with its method. And I've noticed this from my experience too in working with agencies and people more focused on government policy, that people are skeptical that anything can be done unless you can show them it's already been done. And then you can take that and improve upon it. And it sounds like New York is trying to do that in its own efforts. So I'm really hopeful on that front too, that the array of tools, quantitative tools that can be used to inform cumulative impact assessment and the decision-making tools also continue to develop, because we're really just at the cutting edge on this right now. We haven't been doing this for many years yet.
Great. Well, Paul, that was really an extensive answer to my question. I think we only have 2 minutes left, so let me end with a question for Sonal. What do you think is important in order to better build capacity among EJ activists and advocates to better utilize Dr. Mohai's work.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think there's a couple things. I think certainly starting with knowing what cumulative impacts work has already happened in the US, both legally, so in terms of the different laws that exist and, you know, commissioners' policies that exist or agency rules that exist on cumulative impacts permitting is one. And then certainly going through the Dr. Mohai School of the Matrix would be very helpful, like really walking through that and understanding the science behind it. I think a lot of advocates have great grounding and understanding public health and science and research, and having maybe some different sessions on how this looks in different states would be really helpful. Certainly understanding what is the existing cumulative impact situation in each state is a very important place to start. Where are your facilities? What is most polluting? What are the different kinds of you know, environmental hazards you're dealing with in the state? What are the biggest ones? And really start to sort of work backwards from there is really important. So I think it's both understanding what's already out there in terms of the legal side, and then understanding what the scientific tools are that already exist will be really helpful for each state advocates to kind of pull together their own initiative. And then certainly in the environmental justice movement, we all want to work together and learn from each other. So I think reaching out to the folks that are doing this work in New Jersey, in New York, I know there are multiple states and folks that I've talked to that are thinking about doing this work in other areas, and like really sticking together and collaborating is very important. So I think the four of us are available for these conversations, hopefully with others and working on this nationally. And I think that's pretty key to building a strong next cumulative impacts law.
Well, that was a great way to close out this session. And like I said at the beginning, we're hoping this is just the beginning of many conversations about this and other related issues. Let me ask everyone to give a huge round of applause to Paul, Jay, and Sono, and I wish everyone a great afternoon.